Hello, and welcome to the Academy of Aesthetic Musings, or our more commonly known name, the Oscarinas. In today's episode, I'm going to be reading through the entire mission statement for the Oscarinas and providing a little bit of commentary as I go along. So let's jump right into it. We, the Academy, are an organization of passionate individuals who value the artistic and transformative experiences found in the arts. In particular, we have a special interest in perhaps the most diverse art medium of all, video games. Founded in 2012, we have been theory crafting the best approach to evaluate life-changing experiences in the world of games, and now we are taking that goal to its natural progression and sharing our discoveries with the world. The Academy will host competitive award ceremonies in which voters will nominate the best game experiences, typically within calendar years, though this may occasionally vary. While the judges are free to vote as they choose, we are a small non-profit crew unbounded by time and culture. This means we will make our selection based on artistic merit and personal experiences, without the need to factor in developer history or popular opinion, though we may include these if we desire. As a demonstration of this, you need look no further than our categories, which emphasize player experience more so than developer accomplishment or reputation. And since we'll be revisiting past years throughout gaming history, this provides us with special advantages that we intend to utilize. We reserve the right to create our own criteria for contender eligibility and to adapt this criteria as needed. We may also use our knowledge and experiences as factors in determining our selection. We are not going to pretend we have not played modern games when nominating retro games, for example. Our goal is to identify the best experiences throughout gaming history, and we believe these experiences should stand the test of time. Therefore, a game is not competing solely within its calendar year, but is also entering the larger conversation surrounding gaming as a whole. For now, a game is eligible to compete in a calendar year at the earliest instance in which it had its first console or other home-based platform such as a PC-based release, regardless of region. This means platforms such as arcades are not eligible until said game is released on some kind of dedicated home gaming platform. There are a number of reasons for this eligibility criteria, but the simple fact is we aren't here to evaluate every game ever made. Our brand focuses primarily on story-driven, aesthetically compelling, and/or thought-provoking experiences. While it is not impossible for multiplayer-centric or sports titles, for example, to be nominated, respectfully, every organization has their preferences, and we are looking to create a curated list of meaningfully artistic experiences for future generations to enjoy and learn from. It is also worth noting at this time that eligibility extends exclusively to computer and/or video games, meaning the game experience must be entirely complete and playable solely with a digital interface. While physical components may be included, a game is not eligible if these components are required to play. In other words, no board games for now. In addition to this, all Academy members have real lives and are not expected to be gaming historians. We are not here to leave shorthanded comments on every game in existence. We are here to share insight from our individual gaming memories, while discovering some new favorites along the way, and holding ourselves to a high standard when we make our voting choices. Ultimately, though, we have to draw the line somewhere in order for this to be achieved at all. Obviously, our approach won't suit everyone, but we will have some exceptions on a case-by-case basis. What separates us from most other award shows, however, is our argument-based selection process. In many award ceremonies, the goal is often some mixture of a popularity contest and the honoring of creator accomplishments, neither of which have any relevance for us. Our goal is concerned with elevating the universal artistic merits of games through the lens of our personal exposure with them. Within our process, voters must develop persuasive reasons for why they feel certain nominees are deserving of occupying their achievement slots. From there, all voters make their final decision, combining their experiences with the game, the arguments presented, and what they feel represents the best experience for the larger cultural community to enjoy. Like any award ceremony, ultimately what is compiled is a list of taste, as dedicated by Academy members, and that provides viewers with the option to agree or disagree at their leisure. But a conversation has been prompted and an archive made, and those two things are admirable goals. Despite eligibility, games may be played by voters in any varying state, including ports, alternate versions, remasters, or even Let's Plays. Remakes and extensive remasters may not be eligible on a case-by-case basis. Games are constantly being revised, enhanced, and modified, so instead of trying to keep up with ever-present change, we will simply evaluate games at the earliest point in which developers had reasonably finished them, but also when they are arguably performing at their best. We can't track when something will be remade as easily as when it first launched. Obviously, significant changes such as a massive visual overhaul will not factor into the voting process, or if they do, they need to be within reason. So for example, if it's a game that has an extensive visual remaster, but the gameplay remains unchanged, then maybe you could play that and talk about it for its gameplay, but you wouldn't necessarily get to use that footage or bring in any of the visual departments for the visual categories, if that makes sense. And I will just say here that for the most part, it seems to be that I'm actually the one who's most lenient on this criteria. I think a lot of members actually prefer to play the games in as original format as they can. Although, again, it depends on the game, it depends on the person. And the reason I just have that all laid out the way that I do is that it's just such a layered mess otherwise. There's so many different versions of these games, and they go through so many transitions, so I just felt it best to be as open-ended as I could. And our kind of baseline for this was that if it means someone getting to experience the game or not at all, then we'd rather them experience it. So if it's going to be a remaster or they're just going to watch a Let's Play, we would prefer that they do that than to just not experience the game at all and then have no concept for what it is when they're coming around to the voting. So that's why we do it this way. And I want to make this point clear because I don't want people to get the wrong impression. The VIP members, the people who participate in the voting, represent a diverse group who are not all gaming journalists, designers, industry professionals, or even quote-unquote gamers. And that is by design. The perspective of someone such as myself, who has a long history of playing, designing, and writing on and about games, is good because it grants me certain insight into not only what I enjoy, but also which games truly stand out from the pack. That said, the perspective of someone who doesn't have such a comprehensive background I hold as equally valuable. One of the reasons I set us up to review retro games is for those folks to begin their journey in discovering well-crafted entries in history, and also to share with us their observations and the things that delighted them. Sometimes things win awards because they impress people a great deal, but they fail to age well. And then we think to ourselves that the list isn't perfect and things should have been done differently. But a perfect list is a human list, made by real people who put forth the best effort they can with the information they have. So if I've given off the impression that we're going to make a list of the exact games that are the most deserving of the exact categories, then allow me to clarify. My efforts as a voter lean in that precision-based viewpoint, but in order to replicate an authentic recreation of an award history, it is vital we have people who can appreciate all of this from a new angle. And it is more valuable to me that my friends who have graciously volunteered their time and efforts to be treated with respect and to have their voices heard. To be sure, while most of us do have an extensive background with games, there are those of us who don't, or who mostly play games from within a bubble. And that's all okay, because at the end of the day, anyone voting is required to hear all of the arguments presented. So even if there's a situation in which they had extremely limited exposure with a game, as long as they meet that minimum of hearing the debate, they can cast in their votes. What I'm building here is part archive and part community. I personally get very passionate about what wins and the messages conveyed by that, but I am more passionate that my community feels that their voices matter. It is honorable to strive for perfection, but it is more necessary to find value in the outcome when we do not reach it. My challenge to VIP members is that you approach each ballot with a willingness to listen to the experiences of others and to be confident with expressing your own views, but I know you guys are going to nail this just fine. And the last thing I want to say on this is that the voters, also known as VIP members, have no cap and no minimum, and currently are only selected by invite only. If I open the floor to everyone, then it will turn this thing into a popularity contest, and we have enough of those. VIP members may vote across 3 separate phases, and so sometimes we will have an influx of ballots per each step of the process. This can be a result of busy lives, but it can also be that sometimes voters feel more or less confident about their knowledge of the current years. With that said, here's our voting process documented for transparency's sake. Academy voters are first dealt a form in which they may elect games from the calendar years in which the ceremony involves. These are games they would like to see receive award nominations, or at least be present on the shortlist. Once all Academy members have sent in their forms, the lists are cross-referenced with one another until a final list of about 30 games is compiled into the shortlist. At that point, voters are sent a list of categories and may nominate up to 5 games for each category. The catch is they may only select games from the finalized shortlist. The reason for the shortlist is that every game added to the list is given special attention with analysis, playthroughs, written arguments, video reviews, and more. In effect, they are a production to put together, and productions cost time and resources. In order to keep this workload to a reasonable amount, we limit the maximum number of games that may participate. We will have a posted list of all the games we sampled or that came onto our radar before the shortlist was composed, so viewers can see which games crossed our paths, along with what made the final cut. One of the most important lessons I learned from practice award ceremonies was the need for a focused ceremony. It does us little good to have 50 games all receiving 1 or 2 nominations, as opposed to 15 with a wide range of nominations. The multitude of nominations for a single game emphasizes how important of an aesthetic experience the Academy values it to be, and it helps viewers compartmentalize it among different contenders. A focused ceremony is a surprisingly challenging effort to create. So I've run a number of award ceremonies in the past, maybe close to half a dozen, and one of the things that made things very exhausting for not just me, but everyone involved, was when it was open-ended and you could just nominate anything, especially in a ceremony where it was looking at something from all time. Because what happened is when we would look at a new category, it essentially meant that everybody in the room had to start over from scratch and explain not only what it was, but why it had been nominated in the first place. And so then we would have to hash out all those arguments. We do that 5 times over. We make a voting selection, and then we move on to the next category. And then suddenly we have to do the same thing all over again. And that was just enormously exhausting. If you've ever tried to run an award ceremony yourself, this shortlist idea is incredibly useful. It allows you to just kind of bracket things in. And, we'll be monitoring this as well. If it comes to a point where it feels like just 30 games is not enough, and there's certain things that aren't getting mentioned, or that really would have gotten a nomination had we just made a little bit more room, then I can adjust it when the time comes. But otherwise, what I'd really like to do is keep it somewhere between a cross of looking at all the games from the year, but also something that just focuses in on which games were the most important. Like, what were our top 10 from, let's say, 1990, for example. You get your top 10 games, and then you just spread them out through via nominations. And that's a much more intuitive and I think more focused way to do it, which is just going to be better for everybody in the long run. It may not seem like it, but I guarantee it, if you've ever been in a ceremony that's just extremely chaotic, it just gets tiresome. And then you start to wonder about things like, well, why on earth is that up for Best Picture? Like, what does it even do? I haven't seen it. I haven't heard anything about it. It's not nominated for anything else. And it just makes for a weird situation where you just don't know what to do with a lot of the information you're given. So that's why we have it set up the way we do. All that said, we may adapt our voting system on occasion, depending on Academy membership and experiences. Presently, we are a small group, so we will be using some variation of a ranked-based voting system for all categories, including eligibility. We also reserve the right to amend the nominees after initial voting if there is particular upset or production complications. Academy admin have plenty on their plate as it is, so despite their best efforts, they reserve the right to make judicial, reasonable changes and will notify members of any important changes with their justifications. There is always room for honorable mentions. And so the reason I say it's a variation of a ranked-based voting system is that in a traditional ranked-based choice, you would sort of rank your selection. Let's say you have 5 nominees, you would rank them from 1 to 5, 1 being your first choice, 5 being your least choice. And in that kind of system, you take everybody's first choice and you cast in the votes for that. And you're checking to see if something has 50% of the votes plus 1. If something does, then it wins. Simple. If nothing does, though, what you do is you take whatever nominee had the least amount of first choice votes, the one that just really doesn't seem to stand a chance, and you would drop that one from the ballot. And then everybody who voted for that one, their second choice votes would get redistributed back out to the other 4 nominees, and then you would kind of assess from there, and you would continue down this process until something wins. And the reason I say it's modified is that's sort of the inspiration for our voting system, but it can't be our voting system because we may only have, half a dozen people voting in a particular season. And if that's the case, it's entirely possible that, 3 of the nominees get 2 votes apiece and then the other 2 get nothing. So it makes this weird situation where you would have to drop like 2 at once, and then you would redistribute no votes because they didn't get any votes in the first place. And so it's very awkward and confusing. And so I've developed my own system, and I can review that in another video, but I want to keep us moving. So with that resolved, we will begin by going back to the past to a time when games were very new, but with hints of artistry beginning to emerge. Our first ever ceremony will in fact occupy 2 years, 1990 and 1991. The 4th generation is when games began their growth spurt. We would also like to play catch up with the rest of the world's gaming ceremonies, so we will likely be covering 2 years per ceremony, though Best Pixel winners will always and only reflect their calendar year for the foreseeable future. While 2-way ties are allowed, Best Pixel should ideally have only 1 winner. We can talk more about ties as well. In a system like this, I've set it up so that ties are pretty unlikely. I think if they do start to come up, though, I do have a method we can use to break ties, which I will more than likely be implementing. So you're probably not going to see a lot of those, especially when it comes to our highest honor, which is, of course, Best Pixel. And part of the reason for that is if you're someone who's thinking like, oh, I love ties, you might not actually. I myself like ties. I think they're interesting. I'm fine with them. I have no problems with them personally. But I noticed that in previous award ceremonies I ran, there was like one in particular where it was 6 out of the 20 or 22 categories had ties, and even as few as that many, there were a lot of people who were just like, come on, can't something just win? This is kind of ridiculous. Our whole point was to determine the one winner of the 5. It was a 5-way tie with the nominees, and now we're electing one to be separated from the rest of the group. And so it just made it hard to figure out what actually won, because we would be like, wait, did this win or did that win this? And then we would have to go back and check, and it just kind of, it didn't ruin it, but it did make things kind of messy. And so I'm going to kind of deviate us away from that, and we'll just decide on a winner, and that's the winner, and that's okay. We don't have to be that obsessive about it. It's not the end of the world. In many ways, combining years will challenge voters to make more difficult choices, since each category will be highly competitive, which should in turn be more exciting for viewers. The downside is we cannot directly compare with other award shows in the same way, though we will have steps taken to be as comparable as possible. With the exception of Best Pixel, which is year-specific, a single game is theoretically eligible to compete in every category, in some cases multiple times. We hope this all-encompassing approach allows games to receive enough achievement to reflect an equivalent of a single calendar year feat. So here's the general criteria for the sorts of experiences that we're going to be looking for. And our first criteria, number 1, is engagement and meaning. Intellectually or emotionally thought-provoking or stimulating. It leaves room for ambiguity, but is not entirely vague or entirely obvious, such that players can come to their own conclusions that are befitting of the themes and ideas presented. And so we're looking for games that are artistic, games that are pushing the envelope for what can be done with the medium, but not necessarily different for the sake of being different either. So this kind of puts a measured perspective on it, so that way we're looking for things that are both innovative and insightful and interesting, but you can also have too much of a good thing. And number 2 is theme and variation. Experience presents a variety of moments that are executed with effects that may differ, but are better understood in conjunction with each other and the encompassing elements at large. In essence, a dynamic experience that is well worth revisiting. And so you're going to want, a game that has some variety to it, and one that's operating under a specific theme. Or multiple themes. And this is all very kind of vague, abstract language, but that's because you really need that when you're trying to make something that's looking for different types of games. I could, for example, just say, well, we're looking for story-based games, but story could be interpreted in a number of ways. And so instead, we're really just looking at the aesthetics that they're utilizing and the way that aesthetics can work. Number 3 is organized. Everything in the game serves a purpose or a function. It has effective layering of ideas or themes. The content holds value, is not filler, and is reasonably paced so as to keep our attention, yet not overstay its welcome. So again, we're asking for a lot, probably, but it's best for the criteria to be hyper-specific. That way, things can reach for that standard, because if something does meet that standard perfectly, well then, that's a shoo-in with us. If it doesn't, then it makes it easier to kind of understand our thought process and decision making around it. Number 4 is aesthetic. Presents content artistically. The use of aesthetics is what makes something art and not just everyday life. There should be some emphasis or interest in the beautiful, and by that I mean poetic beauty. There should be some kind of thought or effort put into the actual aesthetic presentation of the whole experience, down from the menu screen, the end credits, and everything in between. So games like sports titles, for example, or a lot of kind of Call of Duty rehashes, a lot of them kind of have just sort of a generic like menu screen. And I'm not saying the menu screen is the most important thing in the world, it doesn't. But we're not looking for that. We're looking for a game that actually takes itself quite seriously on an artistic level, and it wants to do everything it can to really immerse us in that experience. And so the themes can be about anything. It can be a military story like a Call of Duty, but it will need to present itself in such a way as to communicate that it has some interest in aesthetic concerns. And then number 5 is realistic. It should take itself seriously insofar as it makes an effort to achieve its desired emotional effect. Its leaps in logic are reasonable. So this does not mean that every game or every story has to be serious. That's not what it means. It can be comedy, it can be funny. It just means that the desired emotional effect that they're going for has to be at least, more or less achieved. For example, The Secret of Monkey Island is a game that's clearly meant to be very funny. There's all sorts of jokes and quips in it, and that's, I think, present no matter what part of the game you're looking at. And because of this, it means that it ought to actually be funny. And so if it's funny, then that means it achieved its desired effect. And that might be a personal taste of ours, but we'll do our best to also be objective where we can. Its leaps in logic should be reasonable. They don't need to be perfect, because sometimes you might deliberately make a leap in logic that's really obscure or strange. For example, Dark Souls 2 has a lot of really bizarre transitions in it that a lot of people don't like. But you could argue that it's sort of dreamlike, and that it's deliberately trying to make this bizarre transition between different worlds, and it wants you to actually interrogate and think over those decisions. And I don't know if that is the case. I'm just saying that is one way that we could justifiably go about that conversation, because then it would be a reasonable jump, and then we would have to have a conversation about if it is in fact reasonable, or if it's just too far, or if it doesn't work for us. It just kind of depends. And so to kind of sum up all of those points, you have a couple different ways of looking at it. You have a quality experience on the one hand, and that would be in opposition to a janky one. So if a game's kind of janky and broken, you would think, all right, well, we should want something that's quality. But we would actually want something that is in between the two of them, and that would be a game that has balance. For example, Dark Souls is a very janky game, but it's kind of charming, and I don't think it would win you over as easily if it did not have those moments of jank in it. It sort of makes it special then. But if it was an entirely jank, then it would just be a mess, and it wouldn't really even function or be playable. So usually it's going to be somewhere in the middle. Quality is great, and a perfect quality game is good, but those can be kind of stale sometimes. They can give off the impression of being so polished and pristine that it feels like hospital white kind of look, where everything is just ceases to be meaningful to you after a while, because it's all just done. It doesn't take chances, it doesn't take risks. And so that's why we have kind of this idea of maybe balance is somewhere between quality and jank. And Not to say we won't pick janky games and we won't pick quality games, but more than likely we're probably going to be finding a lot of stuff in the middle. The same goes for innovation versus being conventional. If you're an innovative game, you're obviously very different and you're challenging the way we think about games. And that's a good thing. And we definitely are going to be looking for games like that. But sometimes you can just innovate to the point where it can give off this air of pretentiousness, or it just can make it feel like it's so different and so shockingly strange that it actually doesn't resonate with people because there's just nothing for us to really ground ourselves in. And so a little bit of conventional wisdom might actually be good in that case. And so I would suggest that a game that's timeless is one that has a nice balance of both. There are some things about it that are conventional and are straightforward and are easy to grasp, but then there's some other things that really push boundaries or that do things very differently, and it's very innovative and it's exciting and it's inspiring to play. And so timelessness is probably what we're going to be most interested in. And then you have skill versus style. You can do something skillfully, you can do it very stylistically. If you're doing a nice blend of both, then I would say your game is probably pretty unique. And that's probably going to be something that we'll be interested in. And this is kind of tough because if you're nominating something because of style, there's going to be that knee-jerk reaction of like, oh, well, what about this other one that's so much more skillfully done? And that may be the case, but there might be a real pleasure in something that's just very stylistic. Conversely, something that's just really skillfully done, even if the style is kind of bland, might be something that catches our attention because we're just really impressed with the use of skill there. So it just really depends. It's going to be, again, looking for that middle space. And then the last of these is theme and variation, which I already kind of talked about. If you have a theme and you're bringing in variations or reiterations on that theme, I would say that that's going to create depth for your game, and that would be good. That would mean that your game is stretching itself and trying to at least attempt to make a statement about the human condition. And that's really what we're about here. We're looking at our personal favorites, we're looking at fond memories we have, but we're also kind of interrogating these games and we're evaluating how much of an artistic experience they are. And our list is very much governed by that. Our choices are kind of following under this parameter. And so when we pick something, I would hope as an audience member, you kind of take a minute to kind of assess whether or not you can see the argument that we're coming at it with. It's entirely possible that, like if we don't pick something, like maybe we should have, and maybe it was a deep consideration, but it just didn't come up. I know we've already had some of that with our first season. There was definitely a game that everyone had on their ballot, but it was just ranked a little too lowly, and so it just doesn't make the cut. And so sometimes there's a degree of just the system at work and us doing our best to try to pick the best ones we can. And if we don't always get it perfect, that's an award ceremony for you. They're kind of funky in that way. So anyways, we're always going to present our arguments so that way you can hear them and you know why we're making the decisions that we're making. Sometimes those arguments won't be well articulated or they won't be as fleshed out as they could be. And that's part of the process. We're only human. I think if you were to take all of this into perspective, you'll see that we've done a pretty good job, I think, of making sure that we're being honest with ourselves and reaching for the stars with it. So anyways, I'm going to close this video out, and I hope you'll join me in a follow-up episode where I'm going to talk about all 15 of our categories. I'll see you then.